Picture yourself standing before a mirror that reflects not just your face, but every shadow and every light that dwells within your soul. Jung taught us that true transformation is born when we dare to look inward and confront what we avoid. This video is more than content. It's an invitation to recognize your emotional patterns, reflect daily, free yourself from external expectations, and cultivate connections that honor your essence. Each topic is a key that opens doors to clarity, courage, and authenticity. Prepare yourself for a journey of self-discovery that doesn't just inspire, but awakens real change in your life. Sometimes life seems to follow a script we didn't write ourselves. Days repeat like a clock that's never slow, and yet something inside pulses, asking for change. This silent restlessness is like a gentle knock at the door. We don't know exactly who's there, but we sense that if we open it, nothing will be the same. Jung said that the psyche always moves towards wholeness, and perhaps that's precisely what we feel when something internal pushes us beyond routine. Curiously, these callings emerge when everything seems far too normal. It's in the midst of seemingly stable routine that the feeling of emptiness appears, as if the soul no longer fits in the life built up to that point. It's not the absence of achievements, it's the realization that meaning is missing. Jung called this movement the search for the self, as if our essence began to nudge the ego, warning that the current path is no longer enough. This discomfort appears in the form of questions we can't ignore. Is this it? Am I truly living or merely existing? Those who've felt it know it's not about drama or exaggeration, but about genuine awakening. They're like cracks in the wall of consciousness, allowing new light to pass through. Jung believed these questionings were invitations from the unconscious for us to look beyond the surface. And what's most fascinating is that this calling doesn't happen during grand events, but in everyday details. It might emerge over breakfast, during a distracted walk, or even in an unexpected conversation. It's as if life leaves clues for those who are paying attention, and however much we try to muffle this voice, it returns, because it's not about whim, but about a natural movement of the psyche. It's at this point that we begin to realize something essential. There's a difference between what we believe ourselves to be and who we really are. This is where the portal opens to understanding the distinction between ego and self, a fundamental theme in Jung and the next step of this journey. Much of the internal confusion we face stems from the difficulty in distinguishing who we really are from what we believe ourselves to be. The ego, for Jung, is like the mask we wear to deal with the world. It organizes, protects, defends. It's important but limited. The self, however, is deeper. It's the center of the psyche, the totality that unites conscious and unconscious. Whilst the ego worries about maintaining image, the self desires expansion, authenticity, and meaning. It's as if there were two forces within us, one that insists on repeating already familiar paths, and another that calls us to explore new territories. The ego, trapped in the comfort of routine, fears the unpredictable. The self, in turn, isn't frightened by the unknown, because that's where it finds growth. Jung described this tension as an inevitable part of psychic life, and it's precisely from this friction that the process of individuation emerges, the journey to become who we really are. The problem happens when the ego believes itself to be the absolute protagonist. The person identifies only with social roles, father, mother, professional, student, and forgets that behind these functions exists a greater essence. Anyone who's met someone who lives only to maintain a flawless image, suffocating internal desires, has witnessed the ego dominating completely. But the self, even in silence, never stops trying to manifest itself. And sooner or later, this calling makes itself heard. A simple example shows this difference. Faced with criticism at work, the ego reacts with immediate defense, as if it were a personal attack. The self, however, can listen with detachment, reflect, and even extract learning. This shift in posture doesn't happen overnight. It's built with attention and practice, like learning to distinguish the voice of fear from the voice of wisdom. Jung reminded us that recognizing the self is like discovering that behind the actor on stage, there's also the author of the play. And it's precisely when we begin to listen more to this internal voice that we discover something even more challenging, the parts of ourselves that we hide or deny. Jung called this the shadow, and integrating it is the next inevitable step for anyone seeking emotional freedom. Within each person exists a hidden territory, a dark room where we deposit everything we don't want to show: anger, fears, desires, impulses, and painful memories. Jung called this space the shadow. It's not something malignant, but rather rejected parts that don't fit the image we've created for the world. What's curious is that the more we deny these facets, the more they find ways to escape, emerging in explosions of rage, silent sabotage, or disproportionate reactions. Ignoring the shadow is like trying to sweep dust under the carpet. It looks clean on the outside, but inside, the discomfort only grows. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Recognizing the shadow doesn't mean destroying it, but rather dialoguing with it. Just as an ignored child throws tantrums to be noticed, our hidden parts demand attention. When heard, they stop dominating our unconscious attitudes. This repressed side appears clearly in the triggers that most irritate us in others. When we feel excessive anger towards someone, we're often facing a reflection of what we deny in ourselves. For example, an extremely controlling person might be deeply bothered by others' disorganization without realizing that their own rigidity is also a prison. Jung saw in these reflections valuable opportunities to know ourselves more deeply, as if the other were a mirror of our shadow. A practical example: someone who prides themselves on being calm but explodes and shouts in traffic. This outburst isn't just about the car that cut them off, but about accumulated anger that was never acknowledged. Integrating the shadow is realizing that even uncomfortable emotions have a function. Anger, for instance, can indicate boundaries or injustices. The secret isn't to eliminate it, but to learn to use it consciously, without denying it or being dominated by it. And as we give voice to these repressed parts, we realize something revealing. Often it's the shadow itself that feeds our patterns of self-sabotage. It returns in the form of repetitive behaviors that block our evolution. And it's precisely at this point that the next stage opens up, seeing how we sabotage ourselves and how the lack of boundaries sustains this invisible cycle. Often, without realizing it, we are our own worst enemies. We create goals, make plans, and yet find ourselves repeating the same mistakes as if there were an invisible force pulling us back to the starting point. Jung reminds us that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Self-sabotage is precisely this: hidden patterns that keep us trapped in cycles of frustration, draining our vital energy, and corroding our self-confidence. These patterns can manifest in subtle ways: procrastinating on important projects, always choosing relationships that end in pain, or even feeling guilty for experiencing pleasure and joy. It's as if there were a silent voice within us saying, "You don't deserve it," or "This won't work out." Jung saw in these mechanisms a direct reflection of the shadow and our unresolved psychological wounds. By not recognizing these contents, we allow them to control us beneath the surface, repeating stories of failure. An everyday example: someone wants to change jobs, but unconsciously seeks environments where they'll be undervalued because they carry the belief that they're not enough. This repetition isn't chance, but the unconscious trying to reenact the same pain so that we can finally see it. That's why self-sabotage isn't a sign of weakness, but of an internal conflict that cries out for consciousness. It's the invitation to investigate where our deepest emotional wounds lie. Breaking this cycle requires clear boundaries, first with ourselves, then with others. It means saying no when necessary, recognizing that rest isn't laziness, and understanding that discipline is also a form of self-love. Jung believed that by illuminating these unconscious forces, we conquer inner freedom. The path isn't easy, but each boundary set is a brick in building a more authentic life. It's in this process that we begin to perceive how our emotional patterns silently shape our choices. Each repeated reaction, each automatic response is a clue to how the psyche builds pathways of repetition. To move forward, we need to transform these patterns into something new and creative, and this leads us directly to the next step. The art of transforming emotional patterns into conscious and positive habits. Our emotional patterns are like paths the mind travels automatically. Jung observed that these unconscious habits shape our reactions and often determine our happiness without us realizing it. We repeat old behaviors, both positive and negative, because they've become familiar neural roots. Recognizing this is the first step, realizing that we're not random victims of our emotions, but active participants who can gradually rewrite these pathways. Transforming a pattern doesn't mean eliminating emotions considered negative, but learning to deal with them consciously. For example, feeling anger or anxiety is natural, but allowing these emotions to command our choices is another problem. Jung reminded us that bringing the unconscious to consciousness is essential so we can act with freedom. Emotion, when recognized, becomes a tool for self-knowledge instead of a silent prison. A practical example is using an emotional diary. Recording daily thoughts and reactions helps identify repetitions and hidden patterns. Someone who notices they always react with impatience in meetings, for instance, discovers an opportunity to reflect on internal triggers. Another exercise is naming emotions the moment they arise, like "this is fear" or "this is frustration," which creates a detachment that allows choosing the reaction instead of acting on autopilot. Jung considered this practice a way of integrating consciousness and the unconscious, strengthening the self. Beyond writing, small daily actions can reframe patterns, pausing before responding in a conflict situation, creating self-care rituals, or practicing conscious breathing when feeling anxious. With repetition, these practices form new emotional habits, replacing old cycles that imprisoned us. Jung reminds us that internal transformation is gradual and requires persistence, but each conscious step is a brick in building a more balanced psyche. And as we strengthen these patterns, the need to look more closely at the mind and choices naturally arises, the path that leads us to the power of daily reflection. Daily reflection works like a mirror for the psyche. Jung emphasized that looking inward is essential to integrate the conscious and unconscious. Without this habit, we continue reacting to external situations without perceiving our own patterns. Dedicating a few minutes to observe thoughts, emotions, and decisions creates clarity, as if we were lighting small lights in the dark corners of the mind, revealing details that normally go unnoticed. It's not necessary to spend hours meditating or writing. Even simple moments like reviewing the day before sleeping or breathing consciously in the morning can become powerful exercises. Jung believed that small, consistent actions strengthen the connection with the self, allowing the person to recognize repetitive patterns and identify opportunities for growth. Each reflection becomes an invitation to know yourself better and act more intentionally. A practical approach is writing a key question daily, such as, "What did I learn about myself today?" or "Where did I act on autopilot?" In answering, the person begins to observe subtle details of their emotions, reactions, and choices. For example, someone might realize they constantly avoid certain topics to avoid feeling discomfort or notice patterns of irritation in specific situations. These insights reveal contents that the unconscious often tries to show, guiding towards conscious changes. Another useful resource is short meditation or mindful walks, where one observes the flow of thoughts without judgment. Jung saw mindful attention as a path of integration. The more conscious we become of what arises internally, the more we can differentiate between automatic impulses and choices aligned with the self. This practice creates the foundation for freeing oneself from external influences and understanding that validation and others' expectations needn't command our lives. Often, without realizing it, we live according to what others expect of us. Jung emphasized that the psyche seeks authenticity, but is constantly pressured by norms, standards, and external opinions. This need for approval creates a silent weight that limits choices, suffocates creativity, and prevents the self from manifesting fully. Inner freedom begins when we learn to recognize these pressures and differentiate them from what we really want for ourselves. Attachment to others' opinions manifests in subtle ways: deciding on a career to please family, postponing dreams for fear of criticism, or molding personality to fit into social groups. Jung reminds us that by integrating the unconscious, we can perceive where we lose ourselves in the search for acceptance and where we can reclaim our authenticity. Each step in this direction strengthens the sense of identity and clarity about what truly matters. A practical example is observing moments when we feel discomfort trying to please. It might be in work meetings, family gatherings, or even on social media. Questioning, am I doing this because I want to, or so others will accept me, creates awareness. Small decisions like these help separate the impulses of the ego, which seeks approval, from the voice of the self, which desires authenticity and alignment with deep values. Another strategy is creating rituals of reconnection with oneself. Writing personal intentions, reserving moments to listen to one's own body and mind, or even limiting time spent in environments that reinforce patterns of comparison. Jung believed that by detaching from these external influences, we open space for relationships and choices to emerge genuinely. And it's precisely this learning that naturally leads us to the next step: the importance of creating healthy connections that respect our true self. Relationships often reflect what we carry within us. Jung emphasized that people who know themselves minimally tend to attract more authentic bonds, whilst those who ignore their own psyche get lost in superficial or dysfunctional relationships. Healthy connections don't require masks or constant efforts for approval. They flourish when both sides recognize and respect each other's individuality. These bonds manifest in mutual respect, space for growth, and genuine empathy. Someone who practices daily self-awareness and transforms emotional patterns quickly perceives when a relationship is nourishing or toxic. Jung saw in relationships an opportunity to reflect on one's own shadow. Often, conflicts and friction show internal areas not yet integrated, offering valuable chances for personal evolution. Everyday examples include friendships that celebrate achievements without envy, partners who support decisions for autonomy, or colleagues who respect boundaries without demands. The perception of what makes us feel good and what drains energy allows us to choose better whom we relate to, cultivating bonds that strengthen rather than imprison us. Small adjustments in daily interactions, like saying no firmly or expressing feelings openly, create healthier communication patterns. Fundamentally, building conscious relationships is a direct reflection of the internal work we do. The more we know and respect our own self, the more we can offer authentic and deep presence to others. Jung reminded us that by integrating our internal parts, we become magnets for true connections. And upon perceiving the transformative power of these bonds, we complete an essential stage of the inner journey, opening space to apply everything practically in daily life. And so, we reach the end of this journey. But as Jung reminded us, the process of individuation isn't a finish line, but rather a continuous path of self-discovery. Each step you take towards self-knowledge resonates like a seed planted in your psyche, ready to blossom into new choices, new habits, and new meanings. Now you carry with you not just reflections, but tools to transform your daily life into a space of clarity and authenticity. If any idea here touched you deeply, allow yourself to reflect and jot down your own perceptions, because the simple act of recording already strengthens the process of consciousness. Remember, the more you practice, the more the unconscious reveals previously hidden paths, bringing liberation from the bonds that limit and opening space for your true self. This is a call to live with more intention, presence, and courage in the face of your own journey. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these steps resonated most with your life at this moment? Share in the comments, because your experience can inspire other people on the same path of transformation. If this video brought you value, like it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to continue receiving content that awakens, heals, and transforms. Together, we can create a community of people who, inspired by Jung's teachings, dedicate themselves to expanding consciousness and building a life with purpose.